Avatar Meherabad. Yay! Thank you all for coming, and I have to say that this, the fact that we have projection today, we got saved by Jethro, who doesn't seem to be here at the moment.
He's working. Excuse me.
And that's because he went home and got generators and came back and set them up because we have no power today. Yeah, it's really, without that, this would have been tough without projection, I have to say. So, thanks.
Well, we're glad that we got this. We wouldn't want you making hand signals all the time.
Yeah,
all that sort of stuff.
That's what I was planning to do. Right. I also wanted to mention that I meant to get a notice out that there was a mix-up. It hasn't. So I'm doing a chorus rehearsal tomorrow at 2. And this is for all people who would like to join in on sing-along songs for the anniversary. So please feel free to come. This is for expert singers and non-singers and the entire spectrum in between. We're thinking at the anniversary to have the words projected so that the audience can also join in. So that's tomorrow, 2 in the kitchen. Also, I had thought I would be away, not this weekend, but the next coming, and thus this event had been scheduled for Tuesday. That is another of these. But I'm thinking that maybe we should shift it to Friday since I will be here. Do you think that would be better?
Yeah, it's good to stick with a routine.
Yeah, I sort of think so too. So why don't I'll talk to, have another message sent out. So instead of next Tuesday on the subject of Dr. Ghani's manuscript and his draft of the 10 States of God, which he wrote back in the 1940s, very interesting part of the history of speech, you could say. That will be on Friday instead. Okay, so anyone, a singer or a singer wannabe or a singer willing to be or singer can be dragged into it. 2 o'clock tomorrow at the kitchen. Okay, so this is on the subject of Pran and Akash, which turns out to be a really major part of Meher Baba's creation narrative and Meher Baba's cosmological account. It's another one of these major themes which Baba stopped talking about after he went to the West. When he went to the West, his way he presented his message changed a great deal. Even God Speaks, which is Baba's really master exposition, doesn't have a reference to Prana and Akash at all. But in the 1920s, he talked about it a lot, and it really is an important part of the story. So that's going to be my subject today. I think some of you may have, do any of you remember the talk about Prana and Akash? It has come out up in the past.
I remember the words.
Yeah. Well,
Those two.
that's it. And Pran is the same word as prana. But I think Baba is using it in a somewhat more universal and significant way than prana usually signifies to people. You think of prana as something on the subtle planes of consciousness. You know, light becomes manifest and you develop powers and that kind of thing. Well, yes, that is an extension of this, but he's talking about something very fundamental and very universal. And the opposite to it is Akash, which means space. But again, it's a bit deeper than what we normally take space to mean. And I'll just start by giving this thought. If you know, Baba gave the image of the infinite ocean as the original state of God and the beyond beyond, before creation had happened. There's an infinite ocean with no ripples and no bubbles, okay? Well, here's any analogy is limited. And here's the limitation of that analogy. When I envision an infinite ocean, I envision it as having an extension, right? It has space. It goes on and on and on. Don't you think of it that way when you think of an infinite ocean? It goes out, on and on forever with no limits. Well, here's the problem there. In that original state, there is no such thing as space. So actually, that infinite ocean cannot be conceived by us. It is unimaginable. But for anything to happen, there has to be an opening. There has to be an accommodation. There has to be space. If you're going to have a play, you've got to have a stage to put it on. If everything is just all contained, even this doesn't do it, it's all in a single point, the own point. Actually, in the original state, there's not even the own point. But there's no accommodation, there's no receptivity, there's no opening for anything to happen there. So I take Akash to be that primordial potential for something to happen there. It's the opening in which everything can happen. And Pran is what does happen. Pran is primordial movement, primordial vibration. So before creation can occur, you have to have that primordial vibration, and you have to have a receptivity or an accommodation or a space or an opening in which it can happen. And when they clash and meet, that's when creation starts. Does that, you get that idea? You follow that idea? Baba often, he used Akash to talk about this space thing, but there's another word he used called, it's pokal. And pokal means hollowness, which, that if you can get that feeling, it's like a hollowness that sort of invites something to happen there. And I think that his image of the bubble is a very beautiful combination of Prana and Akash. If you think of what a bubble is, its extension is hollow, it's empty, it's the Akash. And the film that makes it the drop into a bubble is like the Akash. So the bubble is a combination of substance and emptiness, you might say. So this is really a big part of the whole creation story, it turns out. And it's not just the creation of the universe. John and I were reading this on the trip from Margaret River to here, Baba's whole series of lectures to the Meherabad boys, where he talked about this a lot. And it turns out that Prana and Akash play a very big role in everything, in the entire creation. They're really a big part of the whole background to it. So it's a huge part of Baba's story, which we're only finding out about because this material from the 1920s is coming to light. These are actually the main sources for it. You can find a bit of it in Infinite Intelligence. Some of you who are, readers of Infinite Intelligence might remember portions that are there. They're quite important, actually. The Tiffin lecture, one of them, the Tiffin lecture of 28th June, suddenly Baba goes into it and gives a whole account. I would say the most important source, though, is Shri's explanations on creation and the universe, which Baba gave to these Meherabad boys, many of whom became Premashram boys, up on Meherabad Hill in December, January 1927-28. He would give these talks in the evening at 7:30 for an hour, in the darkness there, lit with, I guess Jethro was around at the time, but then he brought Petromex lanterns so they could see Baba talking out of the window of what's now the Samadhi. But also, there's Baba incorporated it into the scenario that he had composed for the film he wanted to be made by Hollywood. So he gave this out probably in May 1934 in what's now the Dharamshala at Meherabad. And when he went to Hollywood the next year, he was presenting this to the executives there. And it contains its own account of creation and Pran and Akash. So now the creation story that most of us would be familiar with from God Speaks, and there's a version of it in the discourses and in other places, is out of the beyond state, in the beginningless beginning, the whim of God surged. This word whim is one of the magnificent contributions of the English language to the spiritual vocabulary of the world. I generally get an inferiority complex as an English speaker when I look at Sanskrit and Persian and Arabic. But whim is one of our noble words. There's no word to match it. A sudden, unaccountable urge where God asked, "Who am I?" And that gave rise to the entire creation. So most of you are probably acquainted with that whole idea. Well, there's another whole part of the story, and that is Prana and Akash. So that's what we'll be getting into. So again, feel free to chime in or ask questions or anything else that may, so it's not just me blabbering on and on and on. Here's just to bring to mind what we're talking about. Here's an account of creation in Genesis and from the Old Testament or the Torah for the Christians and the Jews both take this as scripture. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and morning were the first day. I think it's a very inspired account, to tell the truth. Interestingly enough, at the exact historical, I'll just mention, I've been looking for some of the backgrounds to this. I won't try to explain it in already, I've got too much to do without going into that. But at the very time that Baba was giving some of this material in Infinite Intelligence, in his talks to the Ashram Boys and the Tiffin lectures, in the world of science, a revolution was underway right at this time, exactly. And it makes me wonder if Baba wasn't doing something in the inner planes while he was giving these talks. The old Aristotelian view of the universe was that it had existed forever. There was no creation. There was no moment of creation. It always was. And this view had been adhered to throughout the Middle Ages and by modern science too. It was the prevailing view. Creation has always existed. Well, right at this very time, the idea started to be proposed in the world of astronomy and physics that there was in fact a moment of creation. And look when it happened. First proposed by Georges Lemaitre in 1927 and corroborated evidentially by Edwin Hubble in 1929. This theory suggests that the universe originated from a single point at a definite moment in time 13.8 billion years ago. And I'd say this is universally accepted now, that there was a moment where the universe was created, and before that, what was before that is a complete mystery. This was, Hubble's evidence was the evidence of light shift, the shift of, was it red shift in his measurements of other galaxies around the universe, and it's become quite irrefutable under current theory. Also at this time, quantum theory emerged, drawing on earlier discoveries of Max Planck and Albert Einstein. Quantum theory was explicitly articulated between 1925 and 1927 through the work of Niels Bohr, Werner Heisenberg, and others. And it would really be, it will be desirable, it will be a nice thing in the course of time if Baba lovers come into this conversation who really have an understanding in depth of what these theories of physics are. But it really strikes me that Baba's talk about the imagination and infinite intelligence really invites a connection being made with quantum theory. It sure seems a lot like it to me. You can't hear? Speak up? Okay, thank you. One of the questions that had puzzled me for 20 years, this is starting to lead into this topic in Baba's own literary works, came from something in God Speaks at the very beginning, the first pages of it. And let's see, where do I have it? Here. Right on this chapter 2, where Baba starts to talk about the origination of the universe. And, okay, where shall I start this? Okay, the first urge was most finite, but the first urge was of the infinite. Okay. But as this, so it all originates out of a single point, the own point. But this most finite point of manifestation of the latent first urge, which was most finite too, was in the infinite, unlimited ocean. But as it was, this most finite point of manifestation of the first urge was also unlimited. Though through this most finite point of manifestation of the first urge, also most finite, the shadow of the infinite, which shadow, when a reality is infinite, gradually appeared and went on expanding. Okay, and then at the bottom of the page there is this note. The sense to be conveyed is that the shadow of the infinite seeped through or oozed out of the most finite point, right? So you have a shadow seeping or oozing out. But then we get the first experience because of this most finite gross impression of the first urge. That's when the jivatma first experiences things. The finite soul experienced for the first time. The first experience of the infinite soul was that it, the soul, experienced a contrariety in its identity with its infinite impressionless unconscious state. So the soul experiencing its first impression has an impression of almost infinite finitude and limitedness, which is radically at variance with what it is. It's unlimited and infinite. So it experiences contrariety, that is, that it experiences itself as something that is completely at variance with what it really is. And this contrariety has been with us from that moment until now, where we actually have that inner knowledge that we're God, and we experience ourselves as something other than that. Okay, this experience of contrariety affected changeableness and the eternal, indivisible stability of the infinite soul. And spontaneously there occurred a sort of eruption, disrupting the indivisible poise of the unconscious tranquility of the infinite soul, with a recoil or tremendous shock which impregnated the unconsciousness of the unconscious soul, etc. So there's a recoil, a tremendous shock. And I think people like myself who would, try to correlate this with physics would say this is the Big Bang, this is the explosion. So here's the thing that always puzzled me. Earlier he's talking about the shadow oozing and seeping out, and now he's talking about a recoil and an explosion. I had always thought that the emergence of the shadow was another way of talking about the emergence of his creation. But oozing is not the same as an explosion, now is it? They seem to be completely opposite descriptions to each other. So I
It's a
found that,
gradual thing.
yeah, the one is gradual, bruising, seething, and the other is a recoil and an explosion. How can those be the same thing? And what I came to struck me when I read Infinite Intelligence is they're not the same thing. Baba is talking about two separate events. And the seeping of the shadow is the emergence of, and now we're going to go into Infinite Intelligence because this is all too easy to bring Infinite Intelligence into the story, is the emergence of the infinite imagination. And this is thinking the imagination. Any of you remember this from Infinite Intelligence? Vague memories or clear, sharp memories? Here's what, this is coming to Pran and Akash because that's what Infinite Intelligence really makes quite clear. This is that illustration from Infinite Intelligence. And this is what Baba calls the thinking, which is the reality, or it's the consciousness, or it's the drop that is identical to the ocean, right? The soul is actually identical with Paramatma, or the Oversoul. They are absolutely one. And this is the nothing. You might say this little blue drop at the center of all these different forms from stone to human, that drop is the reality, is God himself. And this, the imagination, is actually nothing at all. So the imagination, or the entire universe, is non-existence. It's not there. It's the nothing appearing to be everything, but it has no content. Whereas, you and me, mate, the Jivatma, we are real. We have the real within us. And what happens is that the Baba uses the word thinking to refer to this, which it means the consciousness or the reality, the real self. That's what he means by thinking. The thinking looks at the imagination and says, you are real. Whereas in fact, the imagination is not real. I am real. And what I'm looking at is purely imaginary. So it invests in the universe its own reality, right? I'm going over old stuff, but if this is confusing, please let's talk about it some more, because this is where Prana and Akash come out of. So the entire universe is absolutely nothing, whereas the soul going through the universe is the reality. So, but the soul takes what is nothing to be everything, whereas the soul itself is everything. This is at the core of the whole perspective that Infinite Intelligence gives. It's really not there in God Speaks.
It reminds me, it sounds similar to like what we experience when we're watching like a movie or something.
Right.
We're watching the movie, and after we get absorbed in the movie, and it really becomes very real to us.
Yeah.
But it's really, and then we have to, if we stop, it's just a movie. We have to remind us, it's just a movie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Baba uses that very analogy to illustrate this in Infinite Intelligence. He talks about a villain who's tied a poor heroine to the railway. Some of the tracks and the train's going to run her over. Remember that kind of movie?
Yeah.
And you're sort of watching, is she going to get run over? And just at the last moment, the hero comes and cuts the ropes and saves the day. But then the movie stops, and you suddenly wake up and you realize it never happened. What was real was me. I'm the reality, and this entire universe is not. That's the big, Infinite Intelligence develops this great deal, at great depth. Here's another image of it that Baba gives, which is, this is the universe here, which is a lion, and this is the I. Now actually, the consciousness within the I is real, is the reality itself, is real, capital R. Whereas the universe is completely imaginary, it does not exist at all. But what the eye is doing is, in stone form, it's looking through a tiny hole in the door. What is that tiny hole? It's a form. It's the stone form. Because the stone form is so limited, the opening is infinitesimal. And actually, this is a really beautiful insight, actually. What our form is, what our bodies are, they are openings. That's what they fundamentally are. They are openings by means of which our consciousness can experience the universe. That's really what they are. We think everything else about them. They're these lumps of stuff, and as you get older, they start to have aches and pains, and you've got to feed the damn things, and you get pleasure from the damn things. But actually, they're just an opening to the universe. Now, in this booster form, the opening is bigger, and the infinite intelligence is experiencing more of the universe. In human form, the opening is infinite. We have full consciousness, it's unlimited. And the thinking experiences the universe completely. That's our experience right now. We have unlimited experience of the universe. You might say it's one at a time infinity. We can't experience it all at once, but with any part of the universe that the human mind wants to go to, it's capable of experiencing that. There are actually no limits at all. But what's the problem here? What do you think?
What we're looking at, the imagination.
Right. Doesn't exist. So we're investing reality in the universe when the universe is actually absolutely, truly, and purely nothing. It's not even there. And the one who is real is the one who is looking. But I don't take myself to be real. Through the medium of the body, I take the universe to be real. And none of those things are real. So that's the thinking and the imagination as one of the backgrounds to all of this. Well, in infinite intelligence, if one reads it, I know you've all memorized it, but just forgotten little bits for the moment. This is then the primordial dichotomy. Infinite intelligence gives rise to the thinking, which is the reality, and the imagination, which is nothing. This is the everything in form of a jivatma, and this is the nothing manifesting as the apparent everything. Okay, well now for further subdivisions, as Baba explains in Infinite Intelligence, the imagination is comprised of Pran and Akash. So Pran and Akash belong to the imagination entirely. They're not real. The thinking is real, and it goes from finite false thinking to infinite false thinking, that's ordinary people, to infinite real thinking as a God-realized soul. Yeah?
Well, the two words Prana and Akash, you might have mentioned it before. Are they from Sanskrit or Farsi or what?
Yeah, this is all Sanskrit vocabulary.
Sanskrit.
Yeah. And pran is the same word as prana, talked about in yoga. And these are both words that you'll find in Indian metaphysics, Indian cosmology. I haven't quite been able to find this pair used as Baba uses it. I did find one discussion in Vivekananda for a page or so, where he talked about Prana and Akash. But there are all these subjects that really need to be studied. So if there's someone who's a scholar of Indian metaphysics, cosmology, cosmogony, it would be really wonderful to find out if this has been an idea.
So what's the primal pair in Samkhya?
In Samkhya, actually, that is, I have it right here, in fact. This is one of the major schools of Indian philosophy called Samkhya. I think I mentioned it last week. And here, the primal pair is Purusha, which is consciousness, and Prakriti, which is, they call it primordial nature, or it's like infinite plasticity in this view of things, and Baba refers to Prakriti and Purush sometimes. It's a dualism. There is the self which sees, the Purusha, which is pure consciousness. And there's the universe of nature, which is completely unconscious, but which keeps on molding itself into forms, which Purusha, consciousness, looks at and identifies with. So this is quite a bit like thinking imagination. There's a little bit of difference, but I won't try to go into that so much. But Purusha Prakriti keeps coming up with new forms, and consciousness keeps looking at them and identifying with them, one after another.
And Sattva, Raja, and Tamas are the three modes of material nature. Goodness, passion, and ignorance.
So you would have
in Bhagavad Gita.
The Bhagavad Gita uses this Samkhya a lot. And Baba does refer to it sometimes also, and even in Infinite Intelligence. So it's quite a bit like, at the end of the story in Samkhya is Purusha realizes that it is not Prakriti, dissociates, withdraws into itself, knows itself, and Prakriti recedes into complete silence and quiescence. So there's a dualism there. There are two primal realities, Prakriti and Purush, in this account. But it is very reminiscent of thinking in the imagination. Is this what you're referring to?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I will be, by the way, this you can see, our topic last week, because out of Prakriti, the first evolute is buddhi, remember, intellect, and the next is ahamkara, or egoism, and then you get the five senses coming out of that. So these things are actually related to each other, as a matter of fact. But what happened, here's the storyline that follows from, let's see, coming back to this. Okay, so I am thinking that when Baba talks and God speaks about the shadow oozing out, I'm thinking that what he may be referring to is the oozing of the infinite imagination out of the ocean of God. And that explosion that happens is when the first act of thinking the imagination occurs. Now the imagination, Pran and Akash, are both purely of the imagination. They have no reality in them. So they're part of what we experience in the universe as the apparent reality. And what happens, as Baba explains, he explains it in Infinite Intelligence and his talks to the Mir Ashram boys especially, is that Pran and Akash get separated from each other and then they clash. And with the clash, Baba uses the phrase, there's a flash of lightning. Vij is the word he uses, a lightning flash occurs. And that appears to me to be the moment of the soul's first identification with form. The emergence of the first stone form or early gas form, like that. It's when Prana and Akash clash. And out of that clash, there come the four elements. And here's, Baba gave this, actually this was for the film scenario that he was giving, and he first dictated it. This is a copy of the original type-up of what Baba gave at that time. You can see November 3rd, New York, 3rd December 1931, Baba's very first trip. So he was in Herman and the Hudson at the time. And he dictated this to Margaret Mayo. She was the owner of the house that he was staying in, and she had written some Broadway plays. And she was saying to Baba, Baba, oh, you have to explain, you have to give this in film form. Film is the right medium for your message. And Baba said, okay, sit down. And he dictated this right then and there. You know how Baba was, he wasted no time. So this is the beginning of creation as Baba gave it then. It begins in deep darkness. The darkness gradually to vanish into empty, hollow space. Notice that word hollow. I think it's Baba's rendering of poko, which means hollowness. In the hollow space, a tiny point of light appears. From the point comes Akasha and Prana. Here we have it. A for Akasha, full space, and primal energy, P for Prana there. And now we get a further development of Baba's cosmology. These come together like this, with a clash, chaos. You see them coming together and clashing. And there's a whirling movement that happens. And from this whirling chaos, the primal elements of fire, water, air, and earth come forth. So these four elements have a place in Baba's creation story also. These look to me like they are of the imagination. There are many other places, actually, where you can find Baba talking about the four elements. Again, he dropped this topic in the 30s. He rarely brought it up. From these four begin evolution. Now he has this form. It's that thing there, but now I don't know what this is. Maybe this symbolizes that there's a soul in there or something. Rotating, starting with the electron.
But isn't that the four elements in the middle?
Oh,
Because
that-
in the diagram above, you've got that dotted
Yes,
line around
actually,
the other.
I think you're right. Those must be the four elements, yeah. From these four, yeah. Evolution, rotating, starting with the electron. Describe this process. So this is for a film scenario, right? This is what he's envisioning this. Describe this process according to typed copy up to the appearance of the monkey. And then Baba has a whole account of the evolution, which actually reproduced. This has all been published, by the way, in Early Messages to the West. There's a section there called How It All Happened that reprints all of this. So thus we have prana, we have imagination. Infinite intelligence is very explicit about this. Imagination is comprised of Pran and Akash. At the very beginning, they're in a compact unity and they're both latent. But they separate from each other, clash, and then these four elements arise, and out of this comes the whole process of evolution. This is not in God Speaks, but this is part of that whole creation story. I personally think that maybe one of the reasons it's not in God Speaks is that Baba had not explained thinking and imagination since 1926. And to explain all of that would have taken another 5 chapters, you know. So he gave a very simplified account where he skipped all of this. So you won't find in God Speaks a full explanation of what the imagination is. But it's actually there as part of the story. Let's see. So, and I'll just give some more of the content, and we can look at some of the passages here. In fact, here's where Baba explains a bit of this. I might as well look right now. This is from the Tiffin Lectures. In fact, I'll read. This is from the film scenario. This is from Early Messages to the West, where Baba explained a lot of this. God is the real infinite light, and the infinite subtle gas is real infinite darkness. Actually, I should show this chart. Baba had this chart prepared. I think Adi was probably the one who drew it in preparation for his visit to the West in 1934-35. And the actual chart is about as big as this. It's huge. So presumably Baba had this with him and was showing it to the Hollywood producers when he was trying to get them to make this film. This is a blow-up of that top part of it. And you can see, okay, the very top here says, I don't know if you can actually read it very well, it's so small. Okay, God conscious. And here's this is God infinite unconscious. And at the end of evolution, you have God conscious, God realized. Right? So this is the unconscious God. The projection point, which he would call usually the home point. So here's a blow-up of this. So out of the projection point, you have here space and energy. And they're separated from each other. And they combine to produce subtle gases. And out of all these gases, the 276 stages of gas culminating in the electron, and then the atom winds up coming out of this. And God speaks. Baba talks about 7 kinds of gas, and the 7th, he said, is hydrogen. And he said evolution begins with the 4th. So this to me, again, I was always puzzling, well, what about the first 3? How can they even exist if there's no Jivatma there? Well, I think they're of the imagination. They're purely of the imagination. The imagination is a part of the story. And I think for any of you, have any of you ever gone into quantum at all? Some of the double slit experiment? The weird paradoxes that happen. It seems to me that quantum may be exploring the fringes where the imagination starts to take over. The unrealized imagination. That's why you get these. If you measure something, it gives a completely different result than if you don't. That's one of the strange effects of quantum that they talk about. So I think these earlier stages of subtle gas, no Jivatma has identified with them. They purely are of the imagination only. That's how it seems to me.
I feel more likely that no individualized soul yet, because no God is everywhere, even in imagination. You cannot
Yes.
be anything without God.
Yes. Baba does say explicitly in Infinite Intelligence many, many times that infinite intelligence is the imagination also. There's no doubt about that. But there's no Jivatma that's identified.
There's no individualization yet. It takes a while
Yeah.
for individual souls to.
Yeah, but what is individualization? It's where an individual Jivatma identifies with a sense.
separate Jivatmas.
Huh?
For example, Baba even talk of group souls and things like that.
Yeah. I don't think the soul, the Jivatma, has entered into the picture at all with these earlier says.
So God exists in the form of undivided soul there in that imagination. So
I'm
it's
not even sure I would even say that. I think it's just purely the imagination. I think that's all there is. And you do get indications. No, this is a big topic, actually, where what exactly the status is. But but when Baba gives an infinite intelligence, let's see, here's this. This is another account of the imagination and the thinking. Remember, the thinking is the reality or the consciousness or the Jivatma. This is the original state. Baba's using the analogy of Jamshed, which he doesn't say who Jamshed is.
But it looks like his brother.
Looks, yeah. Since we didn't know, his brother had just died, so we put him in. And this is Jamshed creating the universe, right? Well, the creation of the universe has happened before any realization of the universe occurs. You get a lot of explanation of that in Infinite Intelligence. And so there are no Jivatmas in the picture. There's no Jivatma has identified with anything. But what is this? This is the created nothing. The nothing created as the apparent everything. I know these paradoxes are excellent tools for crushing the mind, crushing the intellect.
God is individual soul. So if God is omnipresent, God is in every imagination, including the very early stage.
Oh, I agree with that. But
So there cannot be such a thing as pure imagination.
I think there is, though. I think there is.
How would,
There is in the sense that there is not. It's nothing and it doesn't exist. Yeah.
how would the imagination that you're referring to relate to potentiality?
Yes.
That's
Right.
distinct from realizing.
Right. So this is actually, was brought up Ibn Arabi before, but actually the idea of potentiality comes from Aristotle. And the way that I think these things got talked about in that early philosophy, coming out of Aristotle through Avicenna and the Muslim philosophers, medieval philosophers, is all things exist as potential until they're actualized. And so I think the latent state of the imagination, we could call that potentiality if we want to bring in Aristotelian philosophy, which I know all of you do. No, it actually is a big, major link with the whole Western philosophical tradition, a huge one, this idea of potentiality. But it gets actualized only when someone thinks the imagination by saying, I'm this and I'm that. But I think, Chen, my feeling is the Atma is not in the picture. This is the nothing.
But who does the imagination?
Ishwar.
Yeah, he's God, isn't it?
Yeah, no, God is there. And I remember Bala too once, I really have to find if he ever published this, but Baba was in Guru Prasad, and Baba was saying, God is everything. God is everything. And Baba would make a gesture where, my God, everything. And Baba would, well, what about nothing? God is nothing also. And then Baba said, and if anything has been left out, God is that too. So God is all of this, and He's the nothing too. So the school, okay, so we were talking a little bit about Samkhya and the role which that has. Now, Baba said in Tiffin lectures, he gives an account of this. Let's see, where's the best part for this? No, this is infinite intelligence. Yeah, so this particular lecture on infinite intelligence, Baba starts talking about this topic of Pran and Akash, and I'll read a little bit. Let's see. The point marked 1 in figure 9 contains, so Om point, right? Contains energy and matter in their most finite form. Energy is Pran, matter. Baba actually linked Akash with matter. There's a puzzle, isn't it? Because you think of matter as being substantial, whereas Akash is hollowness. Well, again, quantum mechanics seems to have really blown to pieces that concept of matter. Matter is like probabilities now. Okay. In that finite point, which is the first atom, energy and matter are both are contained. From atom, Chaitanya advances to stone in the jump. Energy is life, or Pran, emanating from the most finite point in the most finite form. Now, matter and energy that are in man, Manushya, are not found to be found in this atom. The matter in human form is much more advanced, indeed most perfect. In stone form, by contrast, matter and energy are most imperfect. So we have an evolution of Prana and Akash that has been happening here. In fact, energy is so minimal, so slight, as if not existing at all. But in men, in human beings, matter and energy, fully developed, have combined in fine form. Okay, and fine is Nirakar, which I won't try to go into and explain. And here's some more. How did this happen? When movement began, 2.1 in figure 10. So movement begins at the home point with the creation of the universe. Energy and matter, which originally had been one, got separated, manifesting as 2 and 3. This is matter or Akash, and this is energy or Pran. Then they clashed together again and combined. It is at this stage, after the clash and the recombining, that they took form, right? So do you get the narrative that's happening? This imagination, it's happening in these are the constituents of the imagination, Prana and Akash. But when they clash, that's when form comes into the picture, and the Jivatma starts to say, I'm Tony. I'm Tony the stone. Are you going to be a stone for purposes
Sure.
of our illustration? Or the electron. I'm Chris the electron. Okay. And then this combined energy and space, Pran and Akash, advanced gradually. Animals, like the lower species, have Akash and Pran. They possess instinct, etc. We talked about this last week. This is Chaitanya. Again, in man, Akash is gross. Behind Akash is Pran, which is subtle. Pran is mind in man, and behind mind is intellect. Behind intellect is egoism, ahankar, and behind that is truth. You remember this from last week? We're talking. This actually all relates to the structure of the false self that we were talking about last week. These are the primal stages of this, the Pran and Akash. And this is an important connection too, that in infinite intelligence and in these earlier years, Baba did not talk about the mental sphere or the mental body. He just talked about the gross and the subtle. And by subtle, he meant to include the entire 6 planes of consciousness. Okay, it's just a different use of the word subtle. Well, here's a reason why that's actually a true characterization of the universe. The whole subtle domain is a manifestation of Pran, and the whole gross sphere is a manifestation of Akash. See, this is actually quite a big connection. The gross world that we see is a manifestation of space or Akash, and the subtle sphere that we enter into when we enter into the spiritual path is a manifestation of Pran. So this is still present to us. When you enter into the path, you go from the domain of Akash into the domain of Pran. And here's, is this making sense? See, there are big connections with Prana and Akash, with the whole the cosmology Baba gave. You get it, Jenny?
Yeah.
All right, you got it.
100%.
100%. Is it David? Does this make sense? All of it?
Ask any questions.
Okay. He'll illuminate, yeah. So you see, Prana and Akash is not just something that happened at the very beginning moment of creation. Actually, the entire structure of the universe is a manifestation of Prana and Akash, which are the imagination which we realize, which we experience. Baba also said to the Mir Ashram boys about this, that the drop, when it reaches the gross sphere, it acquires a bubble. There are no bubbles before that, using this drop and bubble metaphor. You know this from God Speaks, the drops that are one with the ocean, and the drop acquires a bubble. The drop actually acquires a bubble only when it reaches the gross. And when I first read this, I was very surprised by that. I figured that, they would have had bubbles all the way down, but no. So, that's why angels, they're not Jivatmas in the same way. They don't have bubbles, actually. You have to have the gross form to acquire that dimension to things. Here's another anticipated topic. I'm just giving a lot of stuff, so, again, bring up things if you want, or ask questions if you want. But we're going to have a session later about subtle physiology, about the human form as a manifestation in microcosm of the entire cosmos. And clearly this is true. Baba said enough about it to make it plainly this is part of what he held to be true, what he explained is true, though he didn't explain it thoroughly. But he did explain this. In the human body, Pran is represented from the neck up, and Akash is represented from the neck down. So the whole, and Akash is manifested as the gross sphere, and Pran is manifested as the subtle sphere. So the whole domain of Akash comes up to here, and Pran, which is the 6 planes, is up to here, like that. I would think for people involved in medicine in the future, these things are going to turn out to be important when they're fully assimilated. And here's one more thing about Prana and Akash that Baba explained to these Meherashram boys. And he told them all sorts of stuff that, as far as I can see, he had never told anybody else and never really did again. But when Prana and Akash, it actually happens at a certain stage, which maybe we can come to, but when they fully articulate, Pran suddenly separates into 7 layers, whereas Akash always remains single. So that, reminds one of the fact that there are 7 planes of consciousness beyond the gross, but the gross sphere is unitary. And Baba gave this analogy of it. I've never seen this, but he said when a snake is sleeping, when it wakes, it suddenly forms coils. And it doesn't do it one after another. No, they all happen at the same time. Have any of you ever seen a snake waking up? But their 7 comes into existence at the same moment. Similarly, when Pran divides, it immediately forms itself into 7 divisions all at once. What do you think, John? Should I go into the flow of Pran down from the subplane?
Oh, I think so, yeah.
Okay.
That's where the waves are.
Yeah, that is where the waves are. When Baba talked to the Meherashram boys, at the very end of his series of talks, come 2 of the strangest things I've ever seen. But he talked about it this way. He said in the 7th plane, all right, Pran is, you can't meaningfully even talk about these things actually. But in the 6th plane, Pran is completely still. In the 5th plane, the souls who are there, it begins to vibration starts. But souls on the 5th plane know that Pran is of no use to them in coming to the knowledge of God. So they never make use of it. That is why souls on the 5th plane do no miracles. They realize it's useless for them. He said, it's never once happened. He actually said to them that they're perfectly capable of doing miracles, but never once in the history of spirituality has a soul actually on the 5th plane actually done a miracle, because they know it's useless. But on the 4th plane, the soul, suddenly there's a division of Pran into 7 layers of it. And he gives the analogy of like stream flowing down like a waterfall. And between the 4th plane and the 3rd, it's like there's a huge waterfall. Baba had to explain to these boys what a waterfall was, because I think a lot of them had been from places where they would never have seen one, so dry. And the 3rd plane, he said, has 3 parts. The first he compared to when water is starting to flow over the lip of the waterfall. The 2nd is when it's in free fall. And the 3rd is when there's an explosion of drops at the bottom of the waterfall. That's the 3rd plane. And he also explained, this is another whole topic, he told them about all these heavens or skies. The 3rd plane has 3 skies or asmans, And that corresponds to those three levels. But at the fourth plane, someone on the fourth plane is, as it were, at a pool at the top of the waterfall. But because his back is to the waterfall, he doesn't see it. It gives you the idea that the fourth plane soul has no, doesn't know what peril he's under. The waterfall is right behind him and he could fall down, but he's not looking that way, so he doesn't see it. And then at the bottom, the second and first plane, the drops, he says a little more about what happens there. So this would give the image of Pran flowing down from the top to the bottom. And when the drops there, they start to formulate as individual drops in either the third or the second plane. The text is contradictory here. But when it touches the gross, the drop acquires a bubble, he says. And that's when Akash really comes into the story. So, I mean, this is one of the strangest things I've ever read from Baba, actually. But it gives you an idea that Pran and Akash are a huge part of the story of creation and the cosmos. Yeah.
What is the way?
He says, in his talks to the boys, he says a lot about waves. So Tony and Jordan should study up for a surfing outing there. But here is one thing he says about it. He says that everything is divided into 7 parts. He has a whole section on the number 7. This is his talks to the boys. And the fourth wave is the biggest. It rises to its greatest height there, which would seem to suggest why the fourth plane is the plane of power. But he also says other things about it. He says that he develops at length the idea of the drop in the wave. This is his talks to the boys. He brings this up in other places, but never as fully as he does there. And drops have bubbles, and waves also have bubbles. So the drop bubble is the form of Gerd, or David, like that. And the wave bubble is a world, like the earth. And the drop is a part of the wave, and the wave bubble contains innumerable drop bubbles. He has a lot more to say about that. Again, it's very, very strange.
And those are different parts of the wave?
Yeah, and then he talks about waves, and then there are drops that contain other drops. And then he talks about foam, too. He said, drops, bubbles, and foam. And we will talk about foam later. And damn it all, he never did.
It's just lots of drops.
Must be lots of bubbles, must be something like that. He did associate the foam with the throat, as a matter of fact, that part of the physical body. The human body is very, very significant. In another session, we'll go over what he said there. He never gave a integrated account of it, though. He just little hints here and there. All of that. So these are. So let me just read a little bit from some of his talks to the boys, where he gives a lot of this stuff. By the way, this is an illustration of some of this. Let me expand this a little bit. This is from the Tiffin lecture. So here, this is Sat, or infinite Chaitanya. Sat means truth. It's from a stitva, to be. Here we have the original Om point and the matter and energy, that's Akash and Pran. Stone form, you have them separating and clashing. Animal form, you have it doing on a larger scale. In human form, you have it on the largest scale. In human form, we have complete consciousness. We're infinite thinking, as he puts it, in infinite intelligence. Oh yes, and here's one more. I just can't. I'm just.
This is for you.
throwing out all sorts of stuff about Prana and Akash. Here's another thing he explained in his talks to the boys. And this is the original source material earlier from Infinite Intelligence. And I just created a slide where you can see it a little better. This is the source. He said that, if you can see that little shape there, he said that sanskaras in human form have this shape. And there's in parentheses, a snake's bite. And that's not explained, but this is what it would make me think. This looks like a snake, doesn't it? And why a bite? Because in human form, sanskaras bite. I gotta have it, I want it. Whereas when you're a stone, they're very weak and lethargic, like that. Well, Baba does, so here's the waveform, which is built right into the shape of a sanskara, right? In human form. At the end of evolution, and then, that means after that. Those are the natural sanskaras would have that form when they're developed, and I think our human sanskaras would too. Well, here's what Baba says about the waveform in his talks to the boys. For a wave, again, this comes back to the wave here. The swell of a wave corresponds to the pran, and the hollow between waves corresponds to the Akash. So the waveform itself is a manifestation of Prana and Akash. And the waveform is the form of our sanskaras in human form. So, when people with a background in physics and stuff like that get to this material, I think there's really a lot to work with. I don't have it with me right now, but on the internet there's a neat little video that shows the relationship between a circle with its circumference, its perimeter, and the waveform. Actually, when you have a point revolving like that around the center, and the circle is moving along the line, it actually creates a waveform like that. So that makes me think that when Baba is working with a circle member who's on the perimeter, that would be a way of releasing yoga sanskaras because of this connection between the waveform and the circle. Does this make any sense at all?
Why is that waveform, then up there you've got the curl, like
Yes.
E, sort of thing?
Yeah. Baba said at the beginning of evolution, they're like this. Okay. Here's another thing.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas at the end of evolution, they're like that.
Oh, okay.
And this is just me thinking, because this is just a very short note from Baba. It's hard to make sense of it. But I'm thinking that when sanskaras first emerge in stone form or in electron form, they're so weak. There's so little chaitanya, there's so little consciousness in them. It's almost like they're just oozing, seeping out of the Om point, and they don't have any energy to go anywhere, so they just coil. Because they have that tendency to curve like that. So they create coils, but they don't have the vitality, the pran, to move anywhere. But once they've reached like a monkey form, they've got real energy in it. Like that.
Development of will.
Huh?
Like the development of will.
Developmental will?
Development of will.
Development of will. Yeah, they've got will at that point. Whereas in stone form, it's very weak. Yeah,
When
Tian?
God speaks in the chart, Baba says, between each species, like between tree and bird or bird and fish,
Yeah.
and the turning between,
Yeah.
there's a knot.
Yeah.
So I see that in the early stages in that sense.
The knots.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
And there's a knot. It's also repeated in the chart in God speaks.
Yeah.
When the soul reaches the human form or the last animal form,
Yeah.
no longer that knot between two kinds of species
Yeah.
is needed. So that became like that.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And then when you go on enter into the path, you have to untie the knots.
Yeah, then Baba did it the other way.
The other way, yeah. The 7th chapter of God Speaks about the sevenfold veil talks about the untying of the knots and the purging of the colors and all that kind of thing, which would undo the knots created in the course of the evolution. So I'm just sort of pouring out a whole bunch of connections here, and there's really quite a lot of stuff that will need to get studied and sorted out as time goes on.
Would
Yeah.
just out of, it's interesting too that Baba uses these images, whatever, is behind them, the images of waves. And like he didn't exactly live next to the ocean as a surfer,
Yeah.
or have perhaps, I don't know, how much audio waves, or light
Yeah.
waves, or whatever, but he uses those images as though it's quite, obviously quite scientifically familiar, if you like.
Yeah. He didn't even have the advantage of being an Aussie living by the coast.
Yeah. I
I
was
could have
just,
seen them.
just quickly, just
Yeah.
for the memory of it, just reading, is because it's often this 7-wave max is a story that's often
7 wave.
7 waves in the surfing and boating community.
Oh, really? Do they have that idea in the
Yeah.
surfing community? 7 waves?
And so this is a response to that thing, that it's actually, the 7-wave maxim does get something right, because it's not actually scientifically measured now as being an actual truth, it's more of a legend. Although waves have chaotic, but it just sort of describes what I was saying. Although waves have chaotic origins, once a few of them get going, they do tend to settle into travelling groups. Choppy, irregular waves that are generated in stormy regions and head off in the same direction will reach a kind of compromise as they go, bucking and engulfing each other until they organise into somewhat stable and predictable packs.
Huh.
Kind of think that's describing us all.
Yeah. Huh. Huh.
Predictable facts.
Eventually, after we've bucked them all.
Yeah.
Yeah, Chris just reminded me, there's a, when you breathe, there's actually a wave pattern that happens in your spine with every breath. If you're lying down after you're walking, there's a wave that'll happen.
Yeah.
So we have this wave, we have a wave within us with our breathing. I don't know if that's going to come up in your.
No,
But
yeah.
definitely it's there.
Yeah.
And people work with it as well, yeah.
In pranayama and kundalini yoga, the kundalini are
Yes.
represented as a
Yes.
snake, coiled serpent at the base of the spine.
This is the actual, the spine actually does that.
Curving
That
line.
goes up and down. The movement of the spine,
Hmm.
the breath.
Yeah. Yeah, when Baba was talking to the boys, one of the puzzles there is that the subject matter that he was giving to them was unbelievably profound. But I think part of, obviously, worked because these kids went love mad over the very time that he was giving those talks. It's one of the real paradoxes. You wouldn't think this subject matter would produce that result, but it did, right at that time. But I think part of the effectiveness of his presentations is that he used these metaphors, and one of them was the drop, wave, bubble metaphor. He used that a lot. He also used metaphors of lights and light globes and shadows and all that stuff. And those metaphors Baba continued to use throughout his life, so you'll have them in God Speaks too. So these are basic images that Baba used to try to explain things which we really would have a hard time understanding otherwise. So here's some of the original text. I'm going to read a little bit from Baba's talks to the Mir Ashram boys. So let's see, can I expand it? What happens if I try to do that? Okay. We have seen that the world is a bubble, i.e. empty, hollow, poko, right? You've seen the word hollow here. not only this, our world, but everything below this point is a bubble. And he's referring to this drawing here. Everything, this is the ocean of Darya, that's what that means, the ocean of God beyond. Everything below that, he says, is empty. Below this point, the creator is a bubble. I can't read that, sorry, shadow. The Paramatma, ocean, Darya, is above. When this Darya begins to move, the very moment, and rather the very movement, gives a push to, clashes with the hollow, the empty, and that's focal, right? So the movement clashes with the hollow. Now that's a bit hard to conceptualize, how movement and emptiness can clash with each other, but it keeps using that kind of language there. This clash is created by the striking coming into contact with each other. Okay, I have to go to the next page. Okay, I'll just have to read it here because if I expand it, we'll lose it. Of the two, this clash or the striking of the movement with the hollowness, emptiness, creates lightning, beach. I would take this to be the moment of the soul's first identification with the first form. It's the clashing of the lightning here. To understand all this clearly, just remember that movement equals energy equals universal prana, i.e. prana, and Akash, emptiness or hollowness, equals vacant space equals open space. Now, the lightning thus created by the coming in contact, clash, of the movement with the emptiness, and that's focal, is now termed by the scientists as electron. So electron equals lightning. Remember, in this electron too, the drop is there. So you have a jivatma at this point. The drop of the ocean, i.e. the ocean itself, but in its limited form. Remember also that in every bubble, whether a wave bubble or a drop bubble, there is drop, say numeral drops. And the electron created by the clash, as explained above, is the first bubble, i.e. the gross. So the bubble emerges when consciousness reaches the level of the gross, which is the manifestation of Akash. In that electron, drop 2, there is Atma, because the drop or the bubble is the limited element of the great, can't quite read it, unlimited Atma. Great unlimited Atma. It's the drop is the ocean. This is, Vedanta we've got here. Did I skip a page? Let's see.
When you say the emptiness and the movement, in New Confucianism, they use the same word, movement and emptiness.
Do they?
Dong, Xu, to represent yang and yin.
I
So
see.
if you understand that way, the movement is the yang,
Yeah,
and the emptiness is the yin.
the yin.
Yeah, so these two dynamic.
Yeah,
So that
Interesting.
might help.
yes, yes. Okay, there's a real good correlation.
So Ward, were these notes made exactly at the time?
All of this, all we have is the manuscript. But as best I can guess, these were written up on the basis of notes at the time that Chanji took. There are, in one of Chanji's diaries, they'll say, Shri gave a talk tonight on thus and such. V-Day notes and notes.
Were they released at the time? I should know this, I suppose, how the thing was structured, but were they secret only for the boys or only for the boys' eyes at that time, or was he making these notes to be distributed at the time or years later?
Well, they never did get nothing was done with them then. And Baba was giving these talks up on the hill at Meherabad at night, and the boys were there. But the other people of the community would be gathered around the outside. You know, Baba's Samadhi now, if you go into it, there's a window on the right-hand side. Well, Baba was confining himself. It was called the crypt room. He was confining himself to the crypt room. He didn't step out for about 2 or 3 months, actually. And so he would come to the window. He was fasting too. He fasted for 5.5 months. And all the boys would be gathered outside. There was a platform right outside there. And they were gathered into 3 groups. They must be the language groups: Marathi, Gujarati, Persian. And Baba would, it was not December, 7:30, it's completely dark then. So they must have had some bright lanterns, and they clearly had some charts that had been drawn too. They must have been displayed somehow. And Baba would explain in English, and they would get translated by different of the mandali. So can you imagine the scene? I mean,
Did the mandali, did the samadhi look like it does today?
no, not at all.
Did they have the Tata matting?
Yeah, Tata matting.
And that Tata matting had the window in about the same place as the current window.
Yes, there were 3 windows there at the time, yeah. But when Ramju gives a description of this in Sobs and Throbs, and he said nobody could make head nor tails of what this structure was. The strangest thing they'd ever seen, because there was like this underground crypt room, they called it that, with like a wooden platform, and then above it there's a slightly bigger space, and Baba would go sleep in that underground crypt. Well, it's now samadhi, you know, but at the time they had no idea that was happening. And so Baba would be dictating. He was using the alphabet board in those days. And we know that Rausab translated into Persian, because Esfendiyar said that. Who did the other translation? I don't know.
Why do you think Chanji took shorthand?
I am not completely sure about that, but he was very good at it. He would have had enough time too, because Baba would dictate and it would get translated. And he was quite expert. We don't have his original notes, but we have a write-up, and I've concluded that it's most probably done by him. The write-up would have been done by him. In Sobs and Throbs, you know the book Sobs and Throbs by Ramju Abdullah? In it, he has a whole page where he talks about this series of lectures. And he said it's a little booklet, and he said he recommended giving it the title Creation and Its Causes. So that's what we're going to entitle this book, actually. I think it's a very good title for it.
Well, visualising that morning, I can't help but see Jamshed's eye image. You've got Father's eye looking through at these children who...
I know. Can you imagine giving content like this to a bunch of teenagers? And what was their response? They went mad with love.
He blew their minds and opened their
Yeah.
hearts.
You wouldn't think this subject matter would be conducive to that, but it was. It clearly
Did they
was.
go onward to write about it or follow it through? I'm sure this stuff's well known. I don't know.
What's that?
Well, whether any of them went on to follow this through as scholars of this level of metaphysics or what?
Well, all these boys, after Baba finished up with them, he sent them all home, and most of them we never saw again. We saw Esfendiyar Vasali, we saw a couple, but basically it looks like it was an aspect of his work that they have the role to be in the world. I think in their next lifetimes they're going to be.
Because it was amazing that their
Dynamite.
parents were. I mean, Baba was only a young man of 30, which wouldn't give you a huge status in those times, that their families would have agreed to all this.
Ha! Well, that's a big part of the story.
I know, it's amazing.
They didn't.
They didn't.
Yeah, that's part of Sobs and Probs. Right after Baba finished this series of lectures, the last two, as I mentioned, were describing Pran flowing down from the seventh plane all the way to the gross. These some of the most mystical things I have ever read from Meherabad. But right as that was happening, some of these boys were just, I don't know what you say, they went into these states where they were so madly intoxicated with love that they almost died. They were very close to it. They were in quite a fragile state. And thus you hear about Abdullah Pakrawan and Ali and a whole bunch of the others. In fact, on January 1st, 1928, see, this is just before that, the whole school burst out with uncontrollable weeping for hours. And you could hear them a quarter of a mile away. And the Mandalay just were completely baffled by it all. Jim, were you wanting to say something?
Oh, well, I was wanting to say that I thought I remember reading somewhere that I don't know, again, this is something someone said, read, whatever, that they're for the future. These Baba was, the theory was,
Yeah.
Baba was working with them, yes, but he was also, but they will be future people. What he was doing was going to manifest in the future.
That's what I
But
think.
what about that
That's what I
story
think.
about the boy that was, they get so hot, wouldn't they? And they'd lie down in a puddle of water and drive up because they were so hot. And I remember hearing something about Narina being told by Baba that because they had experienced that, the Westerners who came would not have to go through those. Well, it was in one of Gokran's things when they were talking about the premature board, so it was one of those presentations. So that the people who came would not have to go through those arduous processes.
Yeah.
You haven't heard that?
No, but it very well could be. The Westerners didn't go through anything. Actually, nobody, again, went, well, the Mutts were probably experiencing things of this
Was
time.
Alaba in that school?
He was in the Meher Ashram.
Oh, okay.
The Prem Ashram had not been created yet, but it was created because of what was happening right at this time. It was, again, I keep saying this, but talk about good students. Baba explains the seven planes to them, and within a week or two, a bunch of them were there. Is that, I imagine most Aussies are students of that order, but in America, they don't. But but it's so extraordinary that Baba was explaining stuff like this to them, and their response was to go love mad. Isn't that surprising? Because this doesn't seem like he's talking about love at all.
But
So
then
in that session in Meherabad, they talked about somebody looking for Aga Ali and finding him that he'd gone back to Bombay to live and just had a very ordinary life where he was completely veiled from all of this earlier experience.
Yeah. Aga Ali was the hero of Sadhus and Frauds. Apparently it is Asfendir Vasali met with Abdullah Pakrawan much later on, and he was the one of all the boys who had the highest experience. He was actually having six-plane experience. And but when Baba brought him and Aga Ali and another one, Ali Akbar, not Alaba, someone else, to Persia in 1929, and all of them wound up staying there. And Abdullah Pakrawan, when he got close to where he grew up, even though he was an orphan, his parents were both dead, but he wanted to stay. And Baba said, no, not now, wait, and I'll tell you the right time. But he insisted. So when he left Baba, they said there were tears in Baba's eyes. And he never saw Baba again. And Baba gave him 3 orders. This is what he told Sandhya. Not to speak, not to touch money, not to touch women. Well, he started up a business. He had to make a living. And the people he was working with were not doing it right, so he wound up speaking. And then there was mismanagement of money, so he wound up touching money. And then he was working so hard that he hired a maid to clean his room because he had no time to do that. And he wound up marrying her. And he said that he had that inner vision, but it closed up and closed up and closed up until it was completely gone. And so that's what happened with him. I think he felt deep regret. But I personally, I mean, how would we know that, a donkey, talking about this? It seems to me these kids have got to be some of the great spiritual luminaries of the coming centuries, having sat through this stuff. But to talk about head and heart, in fact, Baba told them, this is about the Premashram boys, some I have selected for their love, some I have selected for their heart, and some I have selected for their head. And this looks like head stuff, doesn't it? But that's not how they responded. So I've got to think that some amazing work on consciousness was being done through this. At the end of these sessions, I wish I had a full description, but I heard that Ascendier would say that all these boys were just grabbing Baba. They would not let go. They would try to tear his clothes. They would try to tear his hands and arms, like that. With all the stuff about Prana and Akash. So if you want to go love mad, Prana and Akash is your ticket. Yeah.
Just following up with what Sim was asking originally, so can you just remind us who then typed this page and what year?
You see, we don't know. That's the problem. All we have is the manuscript. But it was very likely composed by Chanji, and he may have typed it too. When we get somebody with the skills or the expertise, we could do a systematic comparison of typewriters, and maybe then we'll...
It had a date on the top though, 1927. The previous page had a date.
Yeah, they give dates.
Top.
No, they give dates.
But they're the dates of when the talks were given, not the dates
No.
When it was typed up. Yeah.
I feel the important thing is that it doesn't matter who typed it or who wrote it down, it's that Baba had it typed by somebody.
Yeah.
And I also agree with Jim that it is not just for those Meherabad boys that Baba gave this, it's for the future.
Yeah.
Baba needed an audience to give these wonderful discourses. So these boys happen to be the audience. Of course, nothing happens accidentally. They're sanskaras and all that. So those things like crying, weeping, in a way, it's not all that uncommon. For example, in some spiritual practices, the first session, people can be given some kind of experience. I read in the Shabbat Surya Yoga, even the first session, people can have experience of the subtle plan, then they start practicing. So I feel this is not just for the boys, it's for the future.
Oh, there's no doubt about that at all. This is by far the fullest, on our topic for today, Prana and Akash, this is by far the fullest treatment of it, I would say. Although infinite intelligence gives us some very important information. For example, when it makes it clear that Prana and Akash, the imagination consists of Prana and Akash. He makes that identification unambiguously. But Baba never explained thinking in the imagination again after infinite intelligence. That's the only place where he gave that out. And that's a big part of the whole picture. But let's see. I'm going to read you more. But now, where and what is that emptiness? Poko, right? This is Akash, the word he was using. He would use Akash in these talks also. We only know that the world is empty. Poko. The world and all its workings is nothing into nothing. That's a quote from Hafiz. Let us have a theoretical proof. We say that God is everything and God is everywhere. So there is nothing but God, meaning nothing is there. Okay? There's nothing but God. So he's saying that nothing exists too. God is that also. Let me see, I'm going to jump a little bit.
So why is there handwritten something about nothing after that? Because the word nothing's in English, but the other words aren't.
Yes, it must be filling in some of the Gujarati. You see, they would fill in Gujarati sometimes. But Baba, here's what I would take that to mean.
You think that's Gujarati writing?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
It definitely is. I can't read it right now, but
Chanji,
it's,
isn't it?
I think it probably is Chanji, but we need to get some professional.
Ruby can identify Chanji's
Oh, Ruby is.
writing because of all of the translation, all of the
Oh, good. I'll take it to her then.
description,
Yeah.
what about me do.
Yeah.
You
Send
just
send her a screenshot.
Yeah.
Mhm. Or when I get back there, I can sit with her, we can look at the manuscript, yeah. It's probably Chanji's. But this is what I would guess from this, because having read a lot of Chanji's diaries, is that this was the very words Baba used, and he used the English word nothing. Because there's a lot of Chanji's diaries that are like that. They'll go back and forth between Gujarati and English, and it's just a guess. But it seems to me to be a very reasonable guess. Chanji could write equally well in Gujarati and English. Why would he have done that, except that that's what Baba said? In phrases like this, when he actually puts in the original. I would take that, these are probably the very words that Baba gave.
Do you also think that some of the English words do not explain the full meaning of some of the terms?
Oh,
So
yeah.
Baba has to use, for example, prana. The
Yeah.
English energy just doesn't.
It doesn't catch.
Yeah. So Baba uses prana in prana. So some of the Gujarati or the
Yeah.
Sanskrit language can have more connotation than the English.
I think, in fact, in the future, that we need to take these words into English and make them a part of our vocabulary. I mean, languages borrow from each other all the time. And a lot of these Sanskrit-derived words, there'll be a few Urdu and Persian words here, but elsewhere, we just need to use them.
So these are already things like yoga, prana.
Sure, yoga,
Yeah,
prana,
things like that.
sanskara,
Yeah.
karma, we've started that process. I think this whole vocabulary just needs to be brought in. It has been for me, I've been working this stuff so much. Like the word poko, it's meaning empty, hollowness, like that. And that is the, so pran and poko, that'd be another way of putting it, pran and akash. Pran and akash, those are, I bet you most of you guys would be comfortable with those words after this session, the experts on it. David especially, as he was explaining.
People update the dictionaries though, Ward, periodically. There's a
Yeah.
sort of an official update, isn't there, of Oxford Dictionary, things like that? And
I
people
don't know,
must
but
have
we-
input into what words are added into the, what passes for the official English language.
Well, yeah, some of the major dictionaries will do that, Webster's and others
Yeah.
like that. And one of the reasons that we put glossaries into these editions, like Tiffin Lectures or Infinite Intelligence, or this will have a glossary too, is because these were a lot of the words that Baba himself was using. And it would really be good for them to become part of our common vocabulary. When we all get reborn in their Baba schools, you know, you'll study all this stuff.
That's right.
If you get a country like places like Australia and America, I mean, our heritage, yes, was British, but it's not now. There's tens of hundreds, thousands of Indians living here and people from the Middle East and all over the place. I mean,
This is how languages change. They'll take in, particularly vocabulary from other languages. English took in a huge French vocabulary after the Norman invasion. The Indian languages have taken a huge English vocabulary, computer, and television, things like that. That's what we have to
Yes,
offer.
only with the accent.
So proceeding from yesterday's portion left off. Okay, I don't want to see. Okay, now proceed. The great ocean of truth begins to move. This movement is universal energy. And I'm thinking that the usual uses of prana are not quite adequate. Baba's not just talking about prana, he's talking about the root of it, primordial movement, primordial vibration. And when I say universal energy, it's like, has that connotation to me. It is this movement is not out of the Darya, and that's ocean, from and in the Darya, nor is it separate, alag from the Darya. That is to say, this movement is caused by no outside force, but from the Darya itself. So this, we're talking about latency or potentiality. This is the nothing that is contained within the everything.
The life force.
Yeah, and it's inherent within the ocean itself, from no outside thing. Baba is really insistent always that God is everything and nothing is outside of God. And nothing, even nothing is an outside of God. That is to say, this, that is to say, this movement is caused by no outside force but from Darya itself. And with this movement came emptiness, poko, in the Darya, the hollow, empty space between the two waves created by the movement, right? So here we're getting the waveform is being explained. The pokal, or the emptiness, is the hollow space between the fullness of the pran. Elsewhere, he says, pran correlates with fullness. Akash, or pokal, correlates with emptiness. Pran corresponds with fullness, corresponds with knowing. Pokal corresponds with emptiness, corresponds with ignorance. Now, I would take this to be knowing and ignorance within the relative domain. You know, are we know or we don't know? Whereas knowledge itself is beyond those. He has some charts here which indicate this.
And also things like waves and space, they're just metaphors. We can't take it too literally.
Yeah, but they're very powerful metaphors. I really do think when physicists and scientists come into the picture, Baba has explained here the source of the wave, right? The source of the waveform. Light, right, is a wave.
But only,
Sound is a wave.
yeah, the sound is only deal with the growth matters.
Right.
Baba talked about the 7 divisions of prana.
Right.
So above the growth, scientists cannot even touch.
Yeah, yeah. It'd be good if we had some real scientists who would get into this conversation. And,
Spiritual part is the inner journey.
yeah, no, but a lot of this does really call to mind contemporary physics, to me anyway. Okay, in the hollow, the in-between waves. This pokal is from and in the Darya. So the emptiness too is within, Darya means ocean, right? It is therefore both the movement and the emptiness are one, yet they are two. What I, Shri, they used to call him Shri in those days, will prove is that energy and pokal both are one in God, and that the universe comes out of this pokal. Now, this universal movement clashes, this is where he describes the beginning of form. Now, this universal movement clashes with the Akash, and the two states are created, one of energy and the other of Akash. This is the introduction. Of energy state is the subtle world, or the Akash state is the gross world, right? So we're having the subtle and the gross as manifestations of these. Of energy, there are 7 divisions. Of Akash, there is only 1 division. Now, what is this Akash? Where does it come from? We shall have a theoretical proof, and now he goes into an elaborate thing, which I won't try to go over here. Now here's, let's see, okay. Again, God is unconscious means knowledge is ignorant. So that's our state. We are a manifestation of ignorant knowledge. Because what we really are is knowledge itself with a K. But we're ignorant because we take the imagination of the universe to be real. Ignorance is knowledge, meaning In Barpur means fullness, there is Pokal, proving that from Pokal is hollowness, proving that from this Pokal, all this world, etc., is created. So, today we understand that. I was talking to these boys, right? Got it, right? In God, there are energy and Akash, always, even when quiet, unconscious. But when in motion, being conscious, they manifest. When this energy in God clashes with Akash, also in God, they manifest in the lightning form. The first creation is this clash. Rather, the cause of the clash, that it, knowledge, is ignorant. When knowledge knows that it knows, then it is Sadguru.
Would you see the lightning is the lightning we see in the thunderstorm, or God's divine radiance?
I take that to be the first consciousness of the first samskara that produces the first identification with form. It's the fourth state of God is embodiment. It's the first embodiment. It's the flash. I am this. I am Gusi. I am Gusi the electron. Remember, we're talking about very.
No. I think that's the beginning of creation. That's
No, that would be true.
Evolution. That I would say that's the divine. That's the illumination of the six-planet people see. That lightning form.
No, I don't think so. I think he's talking about the very beginning of things here. He's talking about the very start.
First start is from God to growth to the growth world.
This is the first gross identification, Prana and Akash. Akash representing gross.
No, Akash doesn't just represent the growth.
In this knowledge. Okay, so here's a little bit of what I was talking about there. Let's see how this goes. Now, when God is conscious, it means knowledge knows that I know not. This knowing that it does not know, that is the knowledge of ignorance. That is to say, Baba used this phrase in a particular way, the experience of nothing as everything. That it is knowing ignorance. We are knowing ignorance at this instant when we take this room to be real. That's what he means by that. Now, in this knowledge, knowing and not knowing both exist, but latent. Do not know means ignorance. So in knowledge, knowing as well as ignorance both exist. This is going to be the Pran term, knowing, and ignorance is going to be the Akash term. So here we have these three. God equals knowledge equals darya. Energy equals knowing equals movement. Akash equals ignorance equals emptiness. Okal. So this is how I understand that Pran and Akash are both of the imagination. This is an infinite intelligence, Baba explains this, that neither one of them is real. But Pran, so to speak, exhibits a likeness to the everything. And Akash exhibits a likeness to the nothing. It's like this primal duality of the real and then the illusory are mirrored in Pran and Akash. And this is the basis for the opposites. This is where the opposites come from. They mirror the real dichotomy of the everything and the nothing. Or to say this again, the everything and the nothing with capital E and capital N. You could say it's a dichotomy, but it actually isn't, because the nothing really doesn't exist. It's a fault, the one is real and the other is not. But when you get these refracted or mirrored into the imagination, Pran, so to speak, represents the everything, and Akash represents the nothing. And from this, all the opposites are derived. And Baba goes into this a good bit in some of these talks. Yeah,
Don't you also say they both exist in God? In the previous page, didn't Baba say in God exists, even though they are nothing?
They exist.
Even though they belong in imagination, they exist. ultimately in God.
Yeah, they exist in the sense that the nothing.
Yes, they exist as nothing in
Yeah.
God.
Yeah, Jeanette?
So that's the beginning of the contrariety.
Yes. That's what I would take it to be. That moment of contrariety in God Speaks, I would take that to be the moment of the clash of Pran and Akash and the first form identification through the first sanskara. So this whole Pran and Akash narrative can certainly be fitted into God Speaks. I don't think it conflicts at all. But you see, when God speaks, Baba hadn't explained the imagination. He had explained it in Infinite Intelligence, but this is 1954, and by then, you know, those people had mostly died, and he was talking to lots of new lovers who didn't have that background. So he didn't try to go into all of that. And he certainly hadn't explained that the imagination is comprised of Pran and Akash.
I think imagination is just another word for nothing.
Yeah.
That Baba used later.
It is. He says that very clearly in Infinite Intelligence itself. That, you see, now this is the, I'm me in my own mind using the primordial opposites and then the derivative opposites. The primordial opposites are the everything and the nothing. And they're not true opposites because one of them does not exist. But the derivative opposites are like good and bad, light and darkness, Pran and Akash. And it's that primordial opposites refracted or reflected within the created domain, creating the opposites of experience which we always operate within.
What did you say that Baba never mentioned Prana and Akash after the 1920s?
I wouldn't go so far as to say that because we have it in how it all happened. Some of it is there. But I would say that fundamentally, with the Westerners, it was not part of the story that he told.
How about in Baji's Mischievous Chicken story, which Baba gave, the points of which Baba gave in 1967?
Yeah, that's a whole story of its own. I'm not going to try to talk about that. But it'd be hard to find other cases.
So just on the topic of the nothing doesn't exist and the
Yeah.
entity does. But the nothing is the illusion that sustains reality by the sense.
Yeah.
So the everything wouldn't exist without the nothing.
Yeah, I know.
Even though the nothing doesn't exist.
Yeah, the illusion that sustains the reality, that strange dedication to God Speaks. Yeah. So what do you take that to mean?
I have no idea.
God needed something to do. It's latent in God.
It's a paradox.
There is a use of the word sustain, that rings that bell in me, to sustain the vision. I can sustain the experience. So I'm thinking the illusion that is capable of actually sustaining the experience of the reality, something like that.
So can you clarify, Barbara said there are many worlds, but when you talk about the universe, you're actually talking about absolutely everything, which then, if everything comes from one point, at one point in time,
Yeah.
that's like a start. So does that mean there's an end?
Yeah, no, the universe has an end in Mahapralaya. In this series of talks, he says very clearly that there are innumerable universes, too.
Oh, okay, that's what I was wanting to know.
And he really does mean universes.
Yeah, so in fact, before this one came into being, there's probably an infinite, well, definitely an infinite number before.
Yeah.
Well, that's all that makes sense to me.
Yeah, he said the universe has been created and dissolved innumerable times. And he also says to the boys, I'm going to tell you a secret. Each individual is his own universe. So if other people seem to be living in their own world, they can just retort, well, this is my universe. If you don't like it, bug off.
It's literal. We can only perceive through our sanskara. So we literally are all in our own world.
Yeah, I think there's really a lot, this is an important thing, part of Baba's philosophy too, the microcosm macrocosm dichotomy is central to his teachings, and I would take that when an individual gets God realized. When I get God realized, my entire universe does also. So when we hear about the multiverse, I mean, I always thought that, well, outside this universe, you go through a wormhole, and then there's another universe there. Well, I would take it in another sense, that all these universes are superimposed upon each other. Like Chris's is superimposed upon Ward's, which is superimposed upon John's. What do you think about that, John? Having Chris's universe superimposed upon yours. This is another very big topic. But in these talks to the boys, it's the most unambiguous statement anywhere that there are innumerable universes. And Baba really kept saying that. In 1962 at the East West Gathering, he told them that. And he said that scientists would come to know this, as a matter of fact.
Again, if you only see it from a material point of view, it's kind of contradictory. In certain schools of meditation at a certain stage, they can see the whole sky, the stars and the moon, the sun, within their third eye.
Yeah.
But Francis wrote in some of his songs about these things. I think when we talk about and study these things, it's very important to keep in mind that Baba talks about the subtle, the mental, and the universe. If we just keep it to the gross level,
Yeah.
I think it sometimes it doesn't make sense. Then we start creating our own theories.
Yeah, but I mean, innumerable universes, I mean, there could be innumerable subtle and mental universes too, correlating to the individual Jivatma at the center.
The gross universe is there because it's all there in our mental universe as seed, and in our subtle universe as energy. That's why the gross universe is there. That's the macrocosm and the macrocosm.
Well, we're just about at the end. Anybody else have any last points to raise before we resolve here?
Roy and I get a lot of, understanding, possibly, from that book by Lynn McTaggart, The Field. It may be, not really on the subject, but it's quantum mechanics looking at, it's a journalist looking at quantum mechanics and, metaphysics and the supernatural and things that can't be explained, and this field idea of existence being not what it appears, but something else which is termed a field.
Yeah. It does seem that in a lot of contemporary physics, the idea of a particle has really almost dissolved away into fields and probabilities and mathematics and things like that. I remember with Baba, with one of the, I think probably Rustam, was saying, well, Baba, surely you can't deny the existence of matter. And Baba said, I certainly can. It's not there. It's not real, actually. It seems so solid, so undeniable, but that's not really what it is. Now science itself has come to it. Baba was saying all these things so far back.
It seems like people who do, who are on the planes and can see from a different vision are never going to participate in any discussion on these subjects apart from giving us this much understanding.
We came a little late, but did you expound on, or Bob expound on the when before all this and how it correlates with this?
Yeah, we did talk a bit about that. I know that this is quite a different narrative than you get in God Speaks. God Speaks, but I did go in the page 9 of God Speaks. I had always found something hard to explain, that he seemed to describe the emergence of the created universe in two ways that I could not reconcile to each other. One, he said that the shadow began to ooze through the Om point, and to seeping or oozing. And at another point, when the soul first experiences contrariety, there's like a clash and an explosion. And those don't seem to me to be the same thing at all. Oozing and exploding are nothing like each other. And what I now feel about that is the oozing is referring to the emergence of the infinite imagination. And the explosion is when the thinking of the imagination occurs, where the soul identifies, the flash of lightning that he's talking about here. So this is a whole part of the narrative with the imagination emerging as Prana and Akash, as a precondition of the first whim having its first experience. It's a whole part of the story that needs to be integrated. And I don't see that it's, I don't feel that it contradicts. It's just a whole dimension of things that Baba did not try to explain in God Speaks.
But the whim must have some imprint on what's actually going to happen in that clash, mustn't it? Like, for some people, it's like we've
The whim motivates it.
Yeah.
The whim is the reason for it. Who am I? Clash! I am Roy the electron. I'm making you an electron now at the very beginning. I am the most finite form. It's the whim that would cause that. Baba didn't talk about the whim here to the boys. He had mentioned things like it in Infinite Intelligence and later on, but he wasn't describing it in that way. The who am I side of the story doesn't come up here.
I think we cannot limit Baba. Baba, in the discourse in Francis Deal with God, even talks about creation in terms of the sound, oceanic sound.
Right, the first vibration.
Yeah.
I mean, that fits right in with this to my mind. Sim?
Much earlier on, probably before Roy came, you had that thing from the First Testament, and you were saying it was quite a significant statement. Did Baba ever refer to that, those early Jewish teachings and First Testament stuff as being insightful?
I've never heard where he did. He didn't seem to talk about those old scriptures very much, as a matter of fact. I went to a library that had an early Gutenberg Bible about 2 years ago, and there was another translation from the original Hebrew. Now, I don't know if the person doing this was on a trip or not, but the person was saying that actually the connotations of the words give a much deeper account than we usually get. And the way he translated it really looked to me like Pran and Akash, that kind of thing was right in that story.
Well,
In the footnote in God Speaks, Baba did say he likes the figure 7, because in some religion, creation happens in 7 days. Things like that.
What about Francis in Stay with God? I mean, he made a lot of different connections back to scriptural things, I guess you could say. And I don't know the book well enough, but is there much in the early Christian or Jewish?
He doesn't mention scripture. You know, he wrote to Baba while he was working on it, saying that he was planning to do a study of the scriptures of the world. And Baba gave him that message, you know. The world scriptures are like rotting bones rotting, you know. And I personally suspect that Bobby Francis took that as the indication, don't go into that. So God really doesn't go into the scriptures very much.
No, scripture wasn't the right word there, but just in terms of the references he makes, I don't recall a lot of the going back to that sort of
He doesn't
creationist
refer to the primary scriptures very much.
No.
Just a little teeny bit, the Quran once in a while, the Gita hardly ever. Yeah, that's really not the subject. And I bet it was because of that message of Baba's. He probably took that as an order from Baba not to make that the focus of Stay with God.
He's got that Fabre d'Olivet, the chap's name.
What's that?
Fabre d'Olivet, that Frenchman. He's got his book down there, which has got the biblical translation.
Right.
It goes into all this business about the create everything happening in potentiality before it. That first book of the Old Testament.
I've never read that. That's right down in your library.
Yeah, I think it's there. It should be.
Okay, well, thanks. So if it's agreeable to everyone, we'll do the next one on next Friday, not next Tuesday. I was mentioning that before. I will be here on Friday, and it seems like it's a better day on the whole.
Well,
Yeah.
also in that email going around, it says Friday the 3rd of June, I think.
Yeah.
Doesn't it?
There's a typo.
The original.
It's latent, but it doesn't exist.
Oh, I see. It's just